Thanks to the organizers for having me here. So I'm going to go through paper. This is, of course, like everybody says, an interesting paper. And so the point of it is to try and help explain what's happening to the distribution of the sacrifice ratio. And again, the key thing that the paper is all about is that distribution, what's happening to the spread of sacrifice ratios. Some of the novel parts of it are this idea of credibility through one parameter, which is kind of nice. Right? We like parsimony. Of course, at an expectations conference, it's also really nice that it happens to flow through the expectation formation process as well. I kind of think that's a very nice feature. So it's done by combining, as Chris was pointing out, rational, in quotes, rational expectations and adaptive learning. And one of the things that Chris didn't really stress too much, although he said there's this 171 disinflation episodes, one of the reasons why that comes about is because he's studying non-OECD countries. The original Ball paper and another paper that they cite are only looking at OECD countries. And so that's one of the things that they do slightly differently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that data. So the results are basically that credibility may help explain where that distribution is headed and how skewed it happens to be. This happens when agents rely more on past information. The mean and the skewness increase a little bit. Again, as Chris pointed out in that last slide, the mean doesn't increase quite as much as the skewness does. The skewness tends to increase way more than the mean does, which is kind of desirable given what the actual data seems to tell us about sacrifice ratio. The other point that I found really kind of fascinating that Chris didn't have time to go through in his paper was that announcements are beneficial even with low credibility. So being able to pre-announce that you're going to have a disinflation episode actually helps even when there's low credibility, which is kind of a key thing for monetary policymakers in that kind of situation. Just because you don't have credibility doesn't mean you shouldn't tell people what you're doing. So I just came off of sabbatical, and I work at a small liberal arts college, so I'm getting ready for faculty meetings with humanists and lots of people who care about language. So I went back and started looking at language of how the description of the data happened to be set up. So, small little changes in wording were kind of important in terms of the data set, and it's one of the reasons why the data set, the number of disinflation periods happen in this data set. On some level, I don't quite know what to make of it in the sense of, okay, these are just, here's my criteria, so my data has changed. I don't think it's that important for the actual results that are looking in, that Chris ends up having. But it is going to have some sort of effect on the distribution, and I think there's actually a point that could be made that might be very, very important given the types of things that this paper is looking at. So the first two are the main papers that Chris happens to talk about when he's talking about which disinflation episodes they discard. And the main differences happen to be in red, which is that Ball is looking at trend inflation as the cutoff number that we're looking at. Goncalves and Carvalho are looking at initial inflation, and Chris and Mariano were looking at the disinflation, how the size of the disinflation. So those are slightly different conditions and slightly different numbers, but not anything crazy. What that means is that there are a lot of hyperinflation episodes that Mariano and Chris have in their data. On some level, that's really good, I think. I think they want that, given that they're trying to get this huge distribution from all of these non-OECD countries. You're going to be getting it. Also, you don't want to discard an entire country just because they happen to have over 20% inflation in the 1960s, they might be perfectly reasonable to study in the 1990s or the 2000s. So I think it makes a lot of sense on some level. My suggestion would be to be more sort of, instead of looking at the disinflation, how much has been disinflated, just look at what the inflation rate was at the beginning of the episode, so that you could take out the hyperinflation cases, which is pretty much the same thing as what you have here, except there are a few of these cases where there's hyperinflation, 300%, let's say, and even if it goes down 50% over less than 50% over that time, you still have 250% inflation. Now, do you want to call that a disinflation episode? Well, yeah, inflation went down, but it's still so high, I'm not sure whether we really want to count that. My guess is that it's not going to change your picture all that much if I look through it, but it would also allow you to sort of describe the quantitative differences between hyperinflation disinflations and non-hyperinflation disinflations, and there may be something there that you might be able to talk about later on in the paper. I'll talk some more. This point you actually brought up in the, because it was brought up from a question about the timing of the information set in adaptive learning. It wasn't entirely clear from the text that you did this, so it makes me feel a lot better now. So it's the time t-1 in terms of the adaptive learning agents are just using t-1 information as opposed to t is kind of important. Should be clear. The other thing, and I think it's probably just an expositional thing in the same way. The Ireland model has autocorrelated errors, and the general model that you start off with doesn't really. Thanks. And I'm not sure when you say the MSV solution in that particular model, whether you're thinking of the rational expectation solution including the autocorrelated shocks. A simple way to sort of make it clear to the reader is just connect back to the model, the general model that you started doing. So basically, tell the reader what y is relative to your original model. So once that Ireland model is estimated on data, the parameter values are used, or some of the parameter values are used, and then some of them are calibrated to generate those distributions that you saw at the end of Chris's paper. So knowing which ones are estimated and calibrated in some cases was very clear, and in other cases it was less clear. So just being a little bit more obvious about that would be nice. And then one of the things, and of course as a learning person, this is what pops into your head. It was also estimated, the model was also estimated on Argentinian data as well as US data, but the gain was the same across both of those, and it's not entirely, so it wasn't, the gain was never estimated, it's calibrated. And it was assumed that they would have the same gain, and my hunch is that they probably shouldn't be. So, you know, just having simulations with some higher gain values, my prior is that they would have higher gain values because they're more worried about structural change than it would be in the US. So that's just something that would be nice. And the other thing that wasn't entirely clear, you did give some information about what types of inflation levels you'll see in the simulations, but I wasn't entirely sure how many of those could be hyperinflation. Again, to get back to the point of where you should separate the data that you collect, it might be nice to sort of be able to say, are there hyperinflation episodes in here? And if not, what would happen if you could push the model to actually generate those kinds of hyperinflations? So like I said, it's not this sort of novel explanation. It hasn't been entirely obvious why there's such a big distribution of sacrifice ratios, and this credibility model seems to be doing a very good job. This larger, more robust set of data, because we've got a lot of non-OECD countries, is kind of useful and gives us a better idea of really how wide that distribution happens to be for these sacrifice ratios. And again, didn't go into the details of this, and Chris wasn't able to either, but the policy and I think you could put even more emphasis on the policy announcements, because I think that's actually really important for monetary policymakers. So thanks.